All right, guys, we ready to roll?
Ready to roll, baby.
Miss Sherry, you good? All right. All right, I'll call this policy committee meeting to order. So I wanted to do this specifically because obviously we've got some second and final read policies that you'll see there on your agenda that we should already have some familiarity with, just because we saw those at our regularly scheduled meeting last month. But then also we have here 7 first and final read policies. So I wanted to make sure you all had an opportunity to, 1, lay your eyes on them, and then 2, ask any questions you may have about these policies, since we will, again, only have a first read, and then we'll vote on these next week. So I think what I'll do here is I will open it up for discussion. And I tell you what, I'd really like for us to go in order if we could with these 7. Let's just start with 1.4, which is school board meetings. Should have paper copy. Obviously, Ms. Ford has emailed those to us also. So we'll start with that policy. Anybody got a question or concern around the edits made to school board meetings? Mrs. Black?
I just have a general statement, and this happens to be the policy where it shows up most conveniently. So on page 2, line 8, I've noticed an inconsistency in all of our policies in using gendered language. And what I would like to propose is that we just remove gendered language through all of our policies as we review them this year. There are a lot of policies that refer to administrators as he. There are a lot of policies that refer to teachers as she, and we all know that that's not the case in every school building in Hamilton County. There are a lot of policies that refer to the director of schools as he, and then come down and says their designee. If we just used their all the time, we wouldn't have gendered language in all of our policies. Because, so you see, if the director of schools or their designee, if we just used their all the time, we could avoid having to constantly go back and change all of the gendered language in all of our policies. So I've noticed this, as I've been sitting on the board, as we've reviewed policies, that we're just not consistent. And for consistency's sake, if when we review a policy and we make the edits throughout this year, because we touch every policy every year, if we just, as we're making edits, remove the gendered language and just use their all the time, or they, then it's consistent and it includes everybody.
So you're saying there's some examples of,
So
say,
on
for
line,
instance,
so on
state
line
might
8
say
it
if the
says,
director of
or their
schools-
designee deems it necessary, he, she will communicate any issues, sorry. Second, the one we're reviewing, school board meetings. And so, and I've just noticed that we're just not consistent in our policies, and if we make an effort to just remove gendered language, it's the easiest way to be consistent throughout all of our policies.
So I guess what I'm asking though is
Sure.
so you're saying there are some lines you've noticed, for example, that would say if the director of schools or his designee deems it necessary?
No, they're pretty consistent when they're adding it or their designee. That's been consistent when they're making those edits, but in other places, it'll say his.
It does, for instance, I never noticed that, so thank you, Jim. But in line 18, it'll say he shall advise the chairman.
Yes.
Versus if we just say they will advise the chairman, is what you're saying, it
Yeah.
already includes he or she.
Right.
Or they, or anybody.
Because Scott, couldn't we get into some sort of legal trouble if we had a he working in where it says a she, or vice versa? Okay.
It's the intention.
It's convention being what it has been historically. He
Sure.
is the indefinite third person singular, but as we through the years we've gone from he to he's, she, to s/he, to it is a mishmash throughout your policy. So it's
Yes.
not a legal issue. It's a draftsmanship issue, and I do think that it does look better to pick something and stick with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they would be a good.
There.
Yeah, just using they and their wherever we have gendered language. And like I said, I've noticed it throughout the year and wanted to say something, but I felt like when we were discussing it with the policy commission, coming to a policy meeting, committee meeting, and then reviewing one that has like inconsistencies in one line of the policy, I felt like it was maybe an opportune time at the beginning of the school year to say
Yeah.
that maybe we should do this going forward.
I'm good with using or their designee. I don't know if it makes grammatical sense to say if the director deems it necessary, they will communicate. It's a plural pronoun, correct?
No.
No.
By convention, convention shifts over time. By convention, the draftsmanship that I learned, yes, it's a plural pronoun, but that's the pleasure of the board. If the board wants to adopt the convention of treating they as a third person, singular, indefinite, I'm fine with that. That's the pleasure of the board.
All right, any other comments about this policy?
I might ask, I mean, whatever you're gonna do, I might ask whatever the convention is that we're teaching as part of the ELA curriculum in Hamilton County Schools. I might suggest that we be consistent with what we're teaching.
Okay. Well, we can refer to
And,
it.
and I don't know what that is. I'm just saying that
It's
that's.
not, that doesn't really fall. I mean, we're not writing where we're having to put he, she, it's typically pronoun that fits, right? I think this is hard because director of schools is, you don't know, could be girl or.
It's a draftsmanship issue that this board gets to choose. It's your policies. It's your, yes, that's right. Get confused. And so with director of schools, you could just as easily say he or she, or, which is I think what TSBA does, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Or you could say they. I defer to the board and how you want to do it. I do think that that the grammar that we use in our policies should be consistent with what we're trying to teach our students, but that's just a personal preference.
I mean, I'll be happy to we can revisit that. We'll find out what it is.
I mean,
So-
I think it's good.
we teach based on what's, like, if they're reading a story and the person is
Right.
male, they're using he. If
Right.
the person is female, they're using she. This is a position. I don't think we explicitly teach pronouns associated with positions.
But I'm sure somewhere in state standards, we have a standard for what the indefinite would be. I'm sure I presume that there is. I know that in legal draftsmanship, the convention is evolving. And once upon a time, the convention was he for indefinite. It became he or she. It is moving towards they. What this board chooses to do is, I do think that we should be consistent, so I agree with Ms. Black's observation. We need to do something and stick with it, just because otherwise it does kind of feel a bit like a mishmash.
Yeah, I mean, like, and my suggestion was just as we're reviewing policies throughout this year, if that is one of the edits that we make, to just, as we're going through them, make the edit to remove the gendered language. By the time we complete a year cycle, we will have touched everything.
Scott, could we see what TSBA is doing? And, I mean, that,
I'll check on that. I'll be happy to check on that. Give me a second. I'll actually look at somebody I know who has their policy manual. If you want to move on, go on to something else,
Yeah.
I'll let.
Okay, anything else on this policy? Mr. Grom?
Well, you know, in terms of just being consistent, on line 6, it's lowercase on director of schools, and 3 words later, it's capital D and capital S for director of schools. So I agree with Ms. Black, and that we need to be consistent as we go through this to where it's grammatically correct. So,
Ms. Black, or I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at, just as a for instance, the policy manual for Bradley County Schools, policy 5800. I know that they're part of the TSBA policy service, and it's his, her. Line 5, the director of schools at his/her discretion may delegate any of his, her duties to other school personnel. That's what TSBA does in that policy. Clearly, if Bradley wanted to change that, TSBA would let them. that's just something that I happened to take off the cuff. It really is pleasure of the board. If you wanted to adopt a particular convention, we can go that direction easily.
Okay. All right. Anything else there? Go ahead, Ms.
Well, yes, on the same tone, look at line 26. So, Ms. Black, is your concern that every time the word "their designee," we would just put "the designee"?
No. Their designee is appropriate. I was suggesting changing all of the he, she references
Oh,
to they or their,
Okay.
to just be consistent everywhere and
okay.
remove the, you know.
I heard the he, she, but the there, you weren't questioning on line 7. There, okay, thank you.
All right, anything else there? All right, I will say, take note, please, at the end of this policy, the additions there on page 3, lines 9, 10, 12, and 13, 15, 16. Mr. Bennett, correct me if I'm wrong, state, under the direction of the state, is that correct? That those 3 lines were added as far as attendance to meetings
I
or?
apologize, let me catch up with you, I'm still looking at other school boards. Okay, so back to 1400. Yes, under electronic participation, yes, sir, you're correct. Those things were added to make it easier for board members to attend remotely. Previously, you could attend remotely, but for very narrowly defined reasons, and they've expanded those reasons as set forth at the end of page 2.
So just out of
Okay.
curiosity, it doesn't give the repercussions if you violate that. What is I imagine it's the state board that takes action.
You just can't vote. It's not that would be my understanding, right? Your vote won't count. We can't count your vote if it
That's right.
doesn't fall under one.
That's exactly right, Mr. Perez. So this lays out what you can do if you need to participate remotely for the stated reasons. So they've added, you're sick or you're in a period of convalescence, there's inclement weather or a natural disaster. And so you've gone from, I think, 3 a year to 3 for those stated reasons. If you exceed those, you could still Zoom in, you just couldn't vote. Likewise, if you just weren't there, if it was an unexcused absence, there really isn't a consequence. At some point in time, let's say hypothetically, heaven forbid this should happen, one of you were convalescing and you were out for more than 3 months. At some point in time, a constituent might say, I don't feel like I'm represented because my board member hasn't been there, and I don't think my board member is going to be able to be there because there's a long-term condition. That's not a state board of that issue. That would actually have to go through the ouster process. The state board can fuss at us, but I'm not aware of the state board ever ousting a board member.
If someone questioned whether or not, like, let's say there was a vote that came down to one vote and one of the votes was electronic and somebody, I guess the public can question whether or not that vote really counted. I mean, that's basically what this comes down to, and say, was he really working?
It's a valid vote.
We'd have to prove it was a family emergency. Yeah, like burden would be on us to prove that the vote actually fulfilled the purpose of this.
That's an interesting question, Mr. Perez. So let's suppose you were out of town, or you weren't here, and you were zooming in per this policy, and someone were to say, well, I don't think that Mr. Perez really had a family emergency. I think he was just too lazy to get here.
Which could be the case.
Well, the law assumes that elected officials act in good faith. So the burden wouldn't really be on you to prove that you had an emergency. it would really be on them to challenge, to prove that they saw you in a movie theater or something else. Now, let's change the facts. Let's suppose that you were Zooming in and it wasn't your third meeting, it was actually your fourth. Well, okay, so if someone who had standing to challenge a vote wanted to take us to Chancery Court and say that policy you adopted didn't actually pass because Mr. Perez wasn't there and so didn't have 6 votes, then, okay, long before that happens, we're gonna revote. So, this is an accommodation for the fact that people do have family emergencies, and they are out of town.
Can I ask one question also? Would, the very first thing it says is, number one, because the member is required to be out of Hamilton County for the member's work, would you consider the board to be work? Because happenstance, just a thing. When Mr. Groen and I were at the legislative meeting, we had to miss a meeting. Could we have participated via video conference because of our work on the board, or does it mean specifically our?
That's an excellent question in the.
And could he and I have sat down together,
Oh yeah.
you know, instead of having, you know.
As long as you didn't
You're right.
deliberate together over where you were sitting, you would have been fine.
Hit mute.
And Mr. Perez is
twisted as our.
Mr. Perez is joking, but actually I would be more worried about that than I would about whether this would be work. So I think it's a great question.
Someone would have to challenge it.
Yeah, well, my view is that it would be the pleasure of the chair, because the chair has to, with the discretion of the chair, I won't say pleasure, the reasonable discretion of the chair has to recognize where you are, recognize it's you, and make a ruling. And so I think this is intended to be common sense. So if you are, let's see here, emergency?
We've never used it.
Um,
Now we're gonna use it. Common sense.
For the board members' work. So I'm gonna, if this were to arise and Ms. Robinson were to say, Mr. Bennett, what do you think? Well, line 30 says, because the member is required to be out of Hamilton County for the member's work. If you are in Nashville as part of your work on the board because you are meeting with the legislator or you're talking to a committee member, I think that is work within the intention of this policy. The point here is that you're not out there on a frolic and a detour. You're doing something that either the work requires you to do it, your employer, or I would say a board member's work would fall within this as well. It's just not a lark.
All right.
All those policies we could have passed.
All right, there's nothing else there on that policy. We'll move to the next, enrollment in advanced courses. So you will see, this is a new policy. This policy is geared around students being able to take advanced courses. So, Mr. Bennett, do you want to speak to this at all, or Dr. Robertson, anybody that?
It's just General Assembly. They, oh, I'm looking at the wrong one. I'm sorry. I was looking at,
42061.
It's
Yeah.
same thing. I mean, it's coming from state board, right? It's a requirement. It actually was supposed to have been approved a year and a half or 2 years ago. Somehow it slipped. And so this is the one, Scott, right, that we haven't had that we were supposed to have. Supposed to be approved in 21, I think. So it follows, I mean, there's nothing in here that like we haven't been following. It just hasn't been, you know, in policy. So this is very reflective of our practice.
All right, any question or concern around that?
Yeah, and this is just me personally, and it might be inappropriate grammar, but when I wrote things that involved grades, the letter grades, when I see the capital A grade of a capital B, can we make that capital A into a, I know grammatically that might be incorrect, but Can those A's be lowercase A's?
It is confusing.
B.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of a sentence.
And again, that's just,
I think actually it could be grammatically
I think actually
correct after a
grammatically correct.
colon.
Well, can you
Yeah.
put the grade of B in quotation marks?
Well, I think actually grammatically correct after
on,
a colon,
Scott.
it's lowercase.
lowercase, okay.
You could just
Yeah.
It
begin
just,
with the
it
word
just,
grade.
to me, it looks,
That's what you're saying, right?
It's like it
Right.
needs some grammar.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll have to look at ELA standards and what they're.
All right, duly noted. Anything else on that policy? All right, let's move on to extracurricular activities. So you will see policy 4.300, the addition of lines 9, 10, and 11, which essentially require parental consent for participation.
For 18 and older, right? So
No. Oh, yes. No, who is
Oh,
not
not
18
Right.
or older.
Okay, yeah.
So any student under the age of 18 need
Permission.
permission to participate. Looks like dated written consent. Yep.
This is an addition statewide, right?
Yes.
Ska- Okay.
Yeah.
This is from the state.
Yeah.
All right, any
And I
question or
apologize. This is
concern
what
on
I
that?
thought you were talking about earlier, I apologize.
All right, good. Let's move to the next. This is 4.403, reconsideration of instructional materials and textbooks. If you look on page 2, you will see your first edit there on line 41, the addition of the words student and also school employee. In addition to parent or guardian, in terms of making a request to review or reconsider instructional material. And then also, well, yes, that's it. And you will see that is related to a footnote at the end there, footnoted to Tennessee Code annotated, so.
And that's state also.
so, John Q. taxpayer cannot make that request.
Correct.
Right.
All right, any other question or concern on that?
Only because of stating that footnote, going back to the one right before, 4.300, shouldn't we reference a new Tennessee code now as well?
Scott, is there a code to reference in?
It
the
is.
Previous policy 4.3?
Yeah,
4.3's,
Go ahead.
it is.
It's not redlined.
Yeah.
On 4.300, there's
Yeah.
not, it's not redlined, so it's the same Tennessee code,
Yeah.
but
This
it's,
is number 2, there's
Yeah.
number 2 there. So it's, there's number 2 on the bottom, it's not red.
Okay.
But it's referenced up here,
okay,
yeah.
excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, again, that was the only edit to that policy. Any question or concern about that one, 4.403?
I want to go back to my question. Somebody said no.
All right,
So just a regular taxpayer cannot make this request. I think that, if I remember correctly, when we talked about the library books and that, it was said no, that they couldn't do that on questioning the library books also. There had to be somebody involved in the school.
Somebody who's affected.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they discuss, that's exactly the way that they said it, was someone who has,
Standing.
they say, that's it, standing in the,
Right. I'm not sure I like that.
take it up with your delegation. Mr. Smith?
So that's a state thing?
Is that right, Scott?
Well, the General Assembly didn't give the public at large a right to complain about what's in the curriculum. So it's not that this board couldn't give an ear to someone who doesn't have any kids in Hamilton County Schools. It's not that you couldn't, it's that the statute doesn't give them a general right to do it. If that makes sense.
They were also avoiding people from out of county who were causing questions, and like all of a sudden you're opening it to the entire public, and that could create, anybody can come and
Like people who don't even
create
live here.
obstacles.
Well, theoretically, that's true, but even if you have someone who lives out of county, your other board policy, I think it's 1404, which deals with appearances before the board, that only applies to residents of Hamilton County. So there wouldn't be an avenue for, let's say, someone in Williamson County to come down here and say, we don't think we like the way that you're teaching your kids in Hamilton County. There's no vehicle for that. Even if we didn't have this policy and we were just looking at it under the appearances before the board policy. Now, just looking here, if you look at 14, I keep saying 14, if you look at 4403 and 4402 in tandem, because we passed them together, it's a very detailed, very elaborate process where we go through and there's a committee that's convened to look through the merit of a particular book. It's a lot of work. The conversation that we had at the time was that if we were going to do that kind of heavy lifting, and if it was eventually going to be a hearing in front of the board, the people who were raising the issue needed to have skin in the game. You know, it needed to be a parent who didn't want their child reading this, or it needed to be a kid who thought that it was inappropriate, or a school employee. Now, I will be very clear. The General Assembly has only given this right to these people. That's not to say that this board couldn't open the door, but you're opening the door pretty wide. So it could, you could do it. You could do it. You're thinking about what to do.
Well, I'm, not held down, but it just concerns me that, the people that are paying the bill, we're saying, we want your money, but we don't want you to have say. Yeah. Just a thought. Not a hill I'm willing to die on, but no means, but.
All right, to put a circle around this one, what we have is what we have to have. That's not to say that you couldn't expand it. It's a matter of this is what we have to have. And maybe at some point down the road, I mean, certainly, Mr. Smith, if your constituents say, Mr. Smith, I'm concerned about this, you can bring it to the board's attention.
And they are welcome to speak to us in a public session.
Well, we do have a part of this policy, Mr. Perez, does say at line 50, notwithstanding any other board policy, no one will be allowed to address the board regarding the content of any book or other instructional material until the procedures of this policy have been exhausted. So what that means in tandem is if, let's say I move here from out of state and I have great concern about a particular book that's being used here, but I don't have any kids in the school, I don't even know about anybody in the school, and I want to address the board saying this is a terrible book, it's too right-wing, it's too left-wing, it's too whatever. This policy says, you got to have skin in the game, and if you're not a parent or a student or a guardian or a school employee, you don't really have any standing to complain about what's in the book, what's in our library or our curriculum, as it currently reads.
Mr. King, did you have I got you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, anything else on this? All right, let's move on to 6.3090, zero tolerance offenses. If you look on page 2, lines 4 through 9, referencing state law.
Mr. Chairman, a question probably for Justin. I know when we first kind of started this, we had some kids that we even had to arrest, going back a few months. And then we did a video and we did some education surrounding all that. Is that ongoing? I mean, are we continuing from time to time to revisit that? Because I just see kids you know, will make a comment, they don't, a bit more serious than anything. I just hate for something to show up on a juvenile record and, you know, they're just having a bad day.
So we're circling back at the beginning of this year to those 2 videos. We made 2 that were kind of age
They were
appropriate.
excellent, yeah.
And asking schools to make sure that each and every kid sees those videos at the start of the year, so.
And this is state policy as well.
All right, anything else on zero tolerance offenses? All right, that gets us to 6.310, alternative education program. You'll see there on page 1, lines 31 and 32, the addition of offenses of violence or threatening the safety of persons. Again, this is tied to Tennessee Code.
A comment and a question, I'm more than gonna hurry and get out of here. My comment is, just to my colleagues here on the board, if you've never been over to Washington Hills, you ought to go over there and walk through and watch what they do. Those guys do an amazing job, in my opinion, over at Washington Hills with tough kids. And they do a great job. That's my comment. My question is, the kids that we're sending over there, I know that sometimes transportation can be an issue. So my son's been suspended, but I can't get him over there. What are we doing in those cases?
So remember, we moved Washington over to the Hillcrest,
Yeah, I'm sorry,
old
Hillcrest,
Hillcrest
right,
building
right.
for that purpose because it's on the bus line.
Yeah.
So the old Washington Hills property was not on the bus line, and so that was a huge issue. We've moved it to Hillcrest, so it's on the bus line, so there were transportation options.
But I
for
live in
parents
Saudi,
there.
and no bus runs to Saudi.
Yeah, so there are ways that we can work with those families. We encourage them to make sure their kid makes it in person. There are some other options that we can look at, but, you know, also remember part of our strategy this year's budget was to expand other options like Opportunity High,
Within
for
their
example.
home
Yeah.
school.
I was gonna ask about that, yeah, because that was the strategy. It's not to say this is your one
That's
option,
right.
but we have a few options.
All right, any other comments, questions on that policy? All right. 6.404, student surveys, analyses, and evaluations. You see the addition, just like the first policy that we looked at, the addition of a designee, not just the director of schools there, in a couple lines 5 and 19, and then lines 13 through 17. About consent.
Is this also state change, or is this,
It is.
Yeah. Now you're catching them all.
Now you're touching.
We all
Well,
see
the,
it.
the,
We
the
got it
zero,
right there.
I saw it too.
the alternative education program, like on the second
Oh,
page, it
there
has
it
he,
is.
she, yeah. So, I mean, like I said, it's everywhere. They're
All right, any questions or concerns around this one? Anything on this? All right, Dr. Robertson.
Yeah, so the point about consistency, this is something we've been talking about internally, not just from a consistency standpoint, but just us keeping up with policy. Like, this is cumbersome, it's hard, and we saw with the cell phone policy, like that became really difficult. So Mr. Bennett mentioned like Bradley County using TSBA's policy service. TSBA offers a service where they will update these for us as they go, right? As new laws are passed or something changes, we'll update it for us, help us with language. It's part of the service they provide. It's not a big expense. In my opinion, I think it's something that needs to be considered just for us to keep up with policy, to make sure that we're on the same page, but also when we run up against those hard policy discussions, that we can go to TSBA and get their expert advice. So, I wanted to see if there's any will.
What's not a big expense?
I think it's like 20 or 20 to 25,000, something like that.
Per year.
And
Yeah.
how much time of our staff is spent?
It's a lot.
reviewing? I mean, we're spending more than
Yeah.
$20,000 worth of staff time in reviewing.
Is this going to affect someone's job?
No.
No,
Okay.
we use them for
It-
something else.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just making sure. I don't want to
yeah,
put
but,
anybody
but
out
it,
of work.
but again, it's also, just with law changes, I mean, in how much of Mr. Bennett's time it takes when we're going back and
A
forth.
time. Now, I will say that the school boards that do subscribe to the policy service, they still spend a lot of time. They still have board policy committee meetings. Bradley County, again, continuing to use them as an example, they do not adopt the policies wholesale. They still have conversations like this, and they still say, no, we're not going to do this, or we will do that. For instance, there's a big discussion right now about whether to adopt changes that TSBA made to the Model Code of Ethics policy, which 1106. So it's not as if the board still wouldn't be involved in this. It's that you would have another voice saying, well, have you thought about? And it wouldn't reduce, it frankly won't reduce any time that Mary and I spend doing this, and it probably wouldn't much reduce the time that Shannon spends on this, but you would have it probably pushed through a lot more quickly, because quite honestly, you'll have someone who is looking at this through the lens of various committees going on in Nashville, looking at it through the lens of the State Board of Education. So I don't want any of you to think, oh, you're just gonna assign this to somebody and then your work ends. It's still your policies. You would still have to adopt them and discuss whether they're a good fit for Hamilton County or not.
Gonna give us a better baseline to start.
And as long as it doesn't go against state policy, we can edit it in any way that we feel is right for Hamilton County.
That's right. And candidly, there are times when I think that TSBA's policies are a great place to start. And there are other times when I think we need to lean in and do something that's a little bit more robust. A great example is the bullying and harassment policy that this board developed with input from the school system administrators and a lot of the students who raised some concerns about it. Our policy is still light years ahead of the TSBA policy, still is. And likewise, the policies on reviewing the curriculum and the reconsideration, our policy is so much better than TSBA's, because this board spent a ton of time working on it, and we had public hearings, and we spent a ton of time drafting and massaging and looking at it. So our policies look very different from the TSBA model policies in those two areas, because they carry the fingerprints of this board. That said, there are a lot of other policies out there that don't really require the personality of the community to be considered, in my view. We looked at some of them tonight. The thing about the threat of mass violence, it doesn't really much matter what this board thinks about it. State law says this is what you're gonna say. So it adds a perspective that I think that this board might find helpful. TSBA does a presentation about the policy service, and if you wanted to invite them to come back, and they were here, I don't remember when they were here, Justin, do you remember? Was it 5 years ago?
I think it was 2016 or 17.
Okay, so it's been a while, but if you wanted to invite them back and ask what they
So,
offer.
I just have a process question. I mean, is this, like, I guess we'd have a contract with them, we already have some contract, but is this just a budget inclusion? You come in and you say, hey, here's the budget and it's included, or do we have to specifically vote to, I mean, I guess if there's a contract, we gotta look at the
Yeah,
contract.
you're gonna, I mean, you would have
Yeah.
to vote on it. And I think to Mr. Bennett's point, I mean, it's not gonna take responsibility away from the board of
Yeah, of course not.
actually approving
still have
policy
to
and
vote.
massaging the policy, but he did some lawyer speak there. He said it wouldn't save a significant amount of time, but it would something.
It would
And-
move
He
things
did
faster.
political
It would move
speak.
it faster, so I'm like,
some of us are experts.
Well, I mean, what it boils down to is sometimes sometimes you all want to table things.
Yeah.
And think about them and table them and think about them. The amount of work that Mary and I and Shannon put into that on the front end is what it is. That's still gonna be the case. We might not have as many rewrites or re-edits, so that's what I mean. We're still gonna be doing the work on the front end, but maybe you finalize something more quickly. That's what
Well,
I'm trying to
and
say.
I think to the point of this one policy that, is brand new to us. If you go back, I believe it was a summer where we were superintendent to resign, we were moving to an interim superintendent, people that were, like, it flipped, and that policy got completely missed.
Yeah.
And so for 2 years, we've technically been out of compliance, right? And TSBA would have said,
Hey, you need this policy.
here's a policy you've got to have. And that's a minor thing, and I don't want to make it over dramatic. I just think from a process standpoint, it could help us save time in the long run. And when we come up against stuff that's hard to work through, an outside point of view is not hurtful.
My point is, I think you just need to bring it to a board meeting and propose it.
Yeah,
and-
I just wanted to
yeah.
make sure there was no, like, great opposition to it.
All right, and then just real quick, again, those policies listed underneath our second and final read. If you look through those, very, very minimal editing to all of those. Most of that is either referencing the correct statute or some elimination of a couple lines or the addition of an S to make a word plural as opposed to singular. So there's very, very minor there, or actually the changing of the name of one of those policies. The policy didn't change, but the title of the policy changed. I only have one quick question about all of those, Scott, and that is policy 5.109 on evaluation. I see in the footnotes a reference that has been stricken, but I don't see any content stricken from the policy.
Yeah, I think that was a dead reference.
Okay.
I think that reference from the state board rule, either they moved something around to another place, or it didn't exist, but that rule is no longer a good reference.
As I said, feel free to quickly look through that. I don't think you're going to find anything of significance there, other than most of those are just cleaning up.
You don't know us.
Oh, I do. Hence my language. Just a little shove.
Carry on, Mr. Chair.
And obviously, it doesn't mean you can't raise a concern next Thursday night, too. So either in work session or preferably in the work session. Yeah. All right, everybody satisfied? All right, good deal. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, Sarah.